CCG, for inviting me. I'm pleased to join this discussion. My purpose here will be to talk about it in broad strokes, but also to try to frame my discussion in terms and concepts that should be familiar to Beijing, and why I do that will become apparent in a few moments. I've prepared a document. I've sent it to Zune. If she wants to distribute it to others, that's her prerogative. So let me begin with the first question. Why did the US-supported Afghan government collapse so quickly? This seems to be something that a lot of people are interested in. Now, there are numerous studies underway trying to determine why the US-supported government collapsed so quickly, but we should not be distracted by academic questions like these. The Afghan people are in the midst of a crisis, and while understanding how they reached this point might help us fashion better responses, no clear answers, let alone broad consensus on this question, will be available anytime soon. Indeed, even the U.S. Inspector General responsible for investigating the rapid collapse has complained his study is near impossible given the secrecy surrounding U.S. policymaking and assessments over the two-decade-plus invasion and occupation. Nevertheless, it is reasonable to offer a number of tentative conclusions about the collapse. These, in turn, may prove instrumental as we consider international responses to the unfolding crisis. Now, here are the key points. First, the pre-US invasion Afghan state was already a failed state, or nearly so. How else should we describe the ongoing civil war, however minimize the state's increasing pariah status, or the fact that it hosted international terrorist organizations? Second, the regime put in place by the US was always a pseudo-state, an occupation regime notable for rampant corruption and failed governance despite billions in support from Washington. Now, preliminary studies indicate the regime failed largely because the US tried to impose American values and standards where they had significant material and cultural opposition. Other assessments indicate a great deal of the regime's corruption was caused by the US itself, and likewise notable for being so awful, it made the return of the Taliban preferable. Now, the only reason this state didn't collapse sooner is because the US didn't evacuate sooner. And the only reason we are surprised by the rapid collapse is because it appears rather obvious now that US assessments of the previous regime's strength were either gross miscalculations or misrepresentations. Third, in fact, it should be noted that Afghanistan has been in various states of collapse since the late 1970s, when the US financed jihadist resistance to Afghani socialism and Soviet support, and the Taliban today are the political and ideological descendants of those US efforts of destabilization. In short, this longstanding legacy of instability must be countered now with decisive actions or risk deepening crises with profound national, regional, and even global implications. Fourth, therefore, we cannot wait for a stable, legitimate state to emerge. The fact that one has not existed and is unlikely to manifest soon is the key problem. And in this respect, we might consider that perhaps the closest analog to the Afghan situation is Somalia. That's the sobering reality that confronts us in Kabul. Fifth, we cannot simply wash our hands of this matter and walk away. We need to understand that it is unreasonable and dangerous to expect the Afghans to solve their own problems internally at this point. Their problems stem substantially from decades of military interventions and occupations by global superpowers. And to expect the Afghans to clean up this mess by themselves, even if the sanctions regime is lifted, is begging for failure and tragedy. Next question. Should the Taliban government be recognized before major increases in international aid? Whether or not the Taliban are formally recognized belies the simple fact that they are a key stakeholder and an unavoidable partner to any meaningful international aid. We have invested the idea of formal recognition with too much significance and done so even more unhelpfully from the perspective of bilateral ties. For example, if we actually care about the Afghan people, and further, if we actually care about stability in Central Asia, then why should we withhold recognition or refuse to work with the Taliban in this period of humanitarian crisis? However, recognition need not be bilateral or a formal declaration tantamount to political and diplomatic support. Rather, a lesser form of tentative recognition can and should be offered multilaterally. For example, through a group like the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. This recognition could be limited simply to acknowledging the Taliban as a vital stakeholder when confronting this crisis without answering the broader questions of whether they have or will constitute a viable state worthy of formal diplomatic recognition. Taking this approach should minimize international criticism by firmly establishing a practical and defensible hierarchy of values. Next question. What about the particularly sensitive issue of restrictions imposed on women in Afghanistan? Without question, the fate of women and girls in Afghanistan under Taliban rule remains a serious concern and has been articulated thusly by many in the international community. However, as a first principle, we must recognize that women and girls are now at greater risk from humanitarian crisis than they are from facing exclusion from educational and occupational opportunities, general freedom of movement, and so on. Second, as a general rule, we must avoid the neo-colonial Orientalist trap of, quote, saving brown women from brown men, the so-called white man's burden approach that both past and present has been used by Western nations as moral justifications for numerous imperialist interventions. It is a proven fact that such interventions more often than not actually hurt women more than helps them. And this has been clearly demonstrated once again with the American experience in Afghanistan. Next point, the solution to this crisis can only be found through a multilateral framework. Bilateral approaches are too risky in so much as they expose both sides to unacceptable political risk. These include general concerns related to diplomatic face, but more importantly, failing to include the multitude of stakeholders in a collective framework can invite more insecurity. Of course, the even greater risk associated with a bilateral response is an ineffective response to the crisis, one that might make the crisis even worse. Consequently, employing a multilateral framework is likely the best way forward. From the Chinese perspective, this approach also aligns with Beijing's repeated emphasis on using multilateralism in international affairs. From the international perspective, it would create more legitimacy, share the burden and risk among stakeholders, and ensure greater chances for success. It can also encourage better partnerships with other multilateral efforts, including potential alignments with the United Nations, the World Health Organization, and so on. It would seem the SCO offers the best existing multilateral organization for confronting the crisis and arguably should take the lead. However, the SCO might also request recognition and support from other multilateral organizations and invite observers to participate, including the UN, WHO, ASEAN, but also AIIB. While it might be too much front-loading to include these others, even in an observer capacity, the connections should be considered, above all with global level and Asian regional organizations. Ideally, this will be an Asian-based response with a global level legitimacy. Next question. Why is China the best candidate to serve as the core of a collective multilateral leadership approach? Perhaps no other country is better suited than China to lead this effort. Other major regional players, including Russia and Pakistan, have complicated histories with Afghanistan that will make it more difficult for them to lead or be accepted as leaders, both by stakeholders within Afghanistan, but also throughout the region. While China itself is not completely immune to such concerns, none other has a cleaner diplomatic slate or comparable capacity. Additionally, only China has both the political and logistical capacity to lead among the major regional powers. Furthermore, it has a suitable, ready-made IR philosophy of promoting multilateralism and avoiding interference and hegemony, promoting win-win solutions, and a shared destiny for humanity. China likewise has considerable depth in terms of vital resources related to aid and development and can call on other multilateral support or initiatives like BRI to help out. Perhaps most importantly, China is unmatched in terms of crisis management experience, and its experience in Central Asia has grown substantially in recent years. And finally, it has already established positive connections with Taliban leadership while maintaining a general neutrality towards stakeholders competing with the Taliban. We have noted thus far the necessity of a multilateral approach, but experience indicates at least one capable nation should stand firm at the core or center of the effort. In fact, this is not just an international principle, but one that is intrinsic to the Chinese political system, along with the idea of collective shared responsibility and the deep experience of creating and sustaining united fronts, even among enemies and competing interests in times of crises. In short, the Chinese model of collective leadership with a strong center can be adapted to the sort of consensus building but results-oriented approaches that this crisis demands. While there are risks, and all the more so with the need for speed to counter the emergency, no one can offer better core leadership, and this presents Beijing and the region with a compelling humanitarian call for action. Now, finally, in closing, I would like to consider the Xinjiang Afghanistan dialectic. And we should note the dialectic of Xinjiang and Afghanistan. It should be clear that the unfounded American and British allegations of genocide in Xinjiang were perhaps conceived as an anti-China propaganda strategy to cover domestic and international failures experienced by both countries, including several of which intersect with each other, be they Brexit, failures to contain COVID-19, Trump's failed trade war, and so on. But above all, to cover the catastrophe of the American-led intervention and withdrawal from Afghanistan. In other words, when Trump announces that he's pulling out of Afghanistan, this is when we really begin to see the promotion of this Xinjiang narrative out of Washington. So indeed, allegations of genocide accelerated with Trump's announced withdrawal, along with his failed trade war and his desire to escape Beijing for his governance failures associated with the outbreak. Biden and other Western leaders have continued this narrative unsurprisingly. That false claims of genocide in Xinjiang are advanced to cover the real tragedies of Western policies in Afghanistan will leave historians shaking their heads. But suffice to say, by China taking a lead in helping to resolve the humanitarian crisis and human rights abuses associated with Western imperialism in Afghanistan, this would be a major win for the Afghan people, the region, and Beijing's international standing. Nothing pushes back against allegations of human rights violations better than actually protecting human rights, particularly when those were abused by Western nations in the first place. Thank you.